So Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth has abruptly fired Army Chief of Staff General Randy George, removing the Army's top officer amid the ongoing war in Iran. A Defense Department official says George was asked to step down and to retire immediately, with former Hegseth aide Christopher Leneve expected to take over as acting Chief of Staff. The Pentagon confirmed the move online, thanking George for his decades of service, but giving no explanation. Two defense officials tell the Washington Post two Army generals also were fired alongside George. Nominated in 2023, George was expected to serve through 2027. He's a West Point grad and has held key roles in the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. The decision is raising questions on Capitol Hill, even among Republicans, including Republican Congressman Rich McCormick of Georgia, calling the firing concerning. So, Tom Nichols, you're writing about this firing in a new piece for The Atlantic. You write this, quote, even in less dangerous times, the public still would have a right to answers about such an unprecedented purge.
All right, friends, Jack Mockler. Here, let's set the record straight. Trump and Hegseth fired the Army Chief of Staff mid-war, without detailed explanation, alarming senior military leaders. The unprecedented move is not how professional militaries operate. It makes allies nervous and sends a chilling signal to every commander about loyalty over competence. This was a massive shakeup. The Army Chief of Staff is the senior most four-star general in charge of the U.S. Army. He had been in the job and was supposed to be there for a 4-year gig. But the reality is there had been rumors that Secretary of Defense Pete Hegseth was going to fire him for some time, predating the war. Precisely, predating the war. And basically this is Secretary Hegseth going after people and has been since he was confirmed into this job and sworn in. He goes after people who have any kind of ties to diversity programs.
Of the senior U.S. military ranks, George is not the first general to get an unwanted retirement invitation from an irate civilian leader. But America is now engaged in its biggest conflict in decades, with thousands of troops headed into possible combat on the shores of a country the size of Alaska, with more than 3 times the population of North Korea, and with a president whose only formal speech on the war so far consisted of 19 minutes of jumbled thoughts. The American people deserve to know why so many of their top officers are being tossed out of their jobs. And a lot of the reporting this morning, Tom, is that George tried to stand up effectively several times to Pete Hegseth on a lot of the decisions he was making, including the refusal to promote people, mostly women, some women of color, who had earned those promotions, and Pete Hegseth refusing that. Just butting heads effectively with George cost him his job.
And if it were only George, and somehow we could trace this to a discrete decision that,
have any ties to the retired General Mark Milley and the previous administration. And that's where Randy George fell in here. This Army general worked directly as the senior military aide for the former Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin. So the reality is, he has been in the crosshairs with Secretary of Defense Pete Hegseth for some time. But here is the thing that makes this single incident even more alarming than it would be in isolation. This was not the first firing. This was not even close to the first firing. By the time Randy George was told to retire, the Trump administration had already removed or forced out at least 13 senior military officials across the Army, the Navy, and the Joint Chiefs. The reporting on the pattern described it as a massive MAGA makeover of the military's top ranks. The highest-ranking military officer in the United States, General Charles C.Q. Brown,
opposing Hegseth, for example, on the promotion lists, or Hegseth's interference in the Army's investigation into this chowder-headed stunt with the helicopters at Kid Rock's house, or some place where they had come to a conflict. You'd say, well, sometimes it happens. A general and a SecDef just don't get along. That's not what's going on. Hegseth has been on a rolling purge of senior officers from the moment he got here, got to the Pentagon. That's really concerning, because there needs to be some guidance behind that. I do think you need to explain to the American people, look, I'm cleaning out these officers because I want officers that have more of a certain kind of skill or more of a certain kind of background. And instead, it seems like this is in particular an animus against the Army, which, Hegseth has some pretty bitter feelings about as a passed over major. who later said that the Army literally, he wrote that it spit him out. And also against
the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff was fired earlier. The Navy chief was fired. 2 other Army generals were removed from key commands the same day George was told to leave. The Navy Secretary departed effective immediately with no detailed public explanation, and in every case, the same vague framing emerged. These leaders were not aligned with the vision, not on board with the direction, not the right fit for what Hegseth and Trump wanted to accomplish. What that framing actually means, what being insufficiently aligned with the vision requires of a senior military commander, is not spelled out. But the pattern of who gets removed and when suggests that the relevant qualification is less about battlefield competence and more about political disposition.
Kind of the American high command in general. This goes back to the day when he dragged 800 generals and admirals into an auditorium and said, new sheriff in town, everybody's got to lose weight. So I think this is a real concern about what kind of political project here is causing, or personal issue for that matter, is causing Hegseth to try to clean out these top ranks. It's really disturbing, and it's especially disturbing when we're in the middle of a war. The elements of the 82nd Airborne could be in Iran. And you just fired the Army Chief of Staff with no explanation, no accusation of wrongdoing, no accusation of incompetence or disloyalty. The American people have a right to know what the heck's going on.
Well, these political purges, there's a long history. You know it far better than I do, Tom, but these political purges of military officers for political, not military reasons always end badly. Of course, the grand historical example is Stalin.
And this story connects to everything else we have been covering, because the purge of the military senior leadership is not a separate story from the constitutional battles, or from the Iran war strategic failure narrative, or from the pattern of installing loyalists in positions designed to operate independently of direct political pressure. It is the same story playing out in the institution that carries the most direct consequences for human life and national security. When political loyalty replaces professional judgment, when the Justice Department gets a loyalist at the top, the consequence is dropped investigations.
Purging his ranks of generals, leading up to the Nazi invasion of the Soviet Union, and Stalin being completely flat-footed. But more recently, I will say, if we want to know how other people are looking at us, let's look how, I'm sure you feel the same way, how I'm looking at President Xi's gutting of his top generals and admirals in China. He's gone on a political purge for his own purposes, too. And every time I see another general with 30 years experience fired, I'm like, good, check. And he continues to do that. He continues purging his top ranks. And again, I understand China sees us as the enemy, so I see that as great news.
When the civil service gets purged, the consequence is agencies that implement political will rather than legal obligation. When the military senior leadership gets purged and replaced with commanders chosen for ideological alignment rather than professional competence, the consequences are people getting killed in ways they might not have been killed if the advice flowing up the chain of command was honest rather than politically calculated. That is the stakes of this particular version of the loyalist installation pattern, and it is why the alarm that senior military leaders expressed when Randy George was told to leave mid-war is not just institutional defensiveness. It is a warning about something genuinely dangerous. Let's go into the full picture. Who has been removed, in what sequence, and what the stated and unstated reasons were. What the pattern of removals tells you about what Hegseth and Trump are actually trying to build inside the Pentagon. What the Iran war connection means for the specific risks created by replacing experienced commanders with more politically compliant ones mid-conflict. And what the broader civil-military norm question looks like when 13 senior officials have been pushed out in the span of a single presidential term. Let's start at the top because the firing of General C.Q. Brown is the anchor event that established the template for everything that followed, and it deserves to be understood in its full institutional significance. General Charles C.Q. Brown was the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. That is not just a senior military position. It is the highest military position in the United States Armed Forces. The chairman is the principal military advisor to the President, to the Secretary of Defense, and to the National Security Council. The person in that role is supposed to provide the most senior and most experienced military judgment available to the Commander-in-Chief. Honest assessment of what is achievable, what is not achievable, what the risks are, what the consequences of various courses of action are likely to be. That advisory function is only valuable if it is honest, and it can only be honest if the person providing it is not constantly calculating whether the advice they are about to give might result in them being the next general to get fired. Trump fired Brown earlier. The BBC reported that the firing was part of a broader Pentagon overhaul and that Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth had repeatedly attacked Brown for focusing on diversity, equity, and inclusion programs. That DEI framing has been one of the administration's go-to explanations for removing military leadership. But the DEI framing, while politically convenient, does not fully explain the pattern because the people being removed are not fringe figures who wandered into diversity programming. C.Q. Brown was a highly decorated combat veteran, a former fighter pilot, a four-star general who had commanded at every level and was confirmed by the Senate as the nation's top military officer. The idea that his primary disqualifying characteristic was attention to DEI programming rather than honest military advice that sometimes pushed back on what the president wanted to hear is not a credible explanation. And the subsequent removals made the actual pattern clear enough that the DEI framing became harder to sustain as the cover story. Randy George's removal is the case that put the real reason on the record most explicitly. An official told reporters that George was being asked to step down because the administration wanted someone who would implement Hegseth and Trump's vision for the Army, not someone with the best operational judgment, not someone with the most relevant experience for the specific conflict the Army was prosecuting, someone who would implement the vision. That is a loyalty test stated openly as a basis for a personnel decision affecting who commands the American Army in wartime. And the reporting that has been covering the military purge most comprehensively documented that senior military leaders were alarmed at the timing, that removing the Army Chief of Staff in the middle of active combat operations was the kind of decision that gets made when political considerations are being weighted more heavily than operational ones. The same day George was removed, 2 other Army generals were also removed from key commands. That is 3 senior Army commanders in a single day in the middle of a war with no detailed public explanation and no indication that any of them had failed in their professional duties. The global news coverage of that day captured the sense of chaos perfectly. Here we are in a war and he is firing the Army chief. That framing is exactly right. The United States is engaged in active military operations. American service members are deployed. And the administration is simultaneously removing the leadership structure of the Army on the basis of political alignment. Those 2 things happening at the same time is not a sign of a presidency operating from a position of strategic confidence and competence. It is a sign of a presidency prioritizing internal political control over operational military effectiveness. The Navy dimension of the purge adds another layer to the picture. Admiral Lisa Franchetti, the Navy chief, was among those removed in the earlier shakeup. Navy Secretary John Phelan later left his post effective immediately with the BBC reporting that his departure came amid tensions over shipbuilding priorities and internal disagreements about Trump's naval agenda. The pattern in the Navy mirrors the pattern in the Army. Leaders who were not sufficiently aligned with the administration's specific vision for how their branch should be organized and operated were removed regardless of their professional qualifications or operational track record. And the effective immediately formulation appearing in the language of these departures conveys the same absence of normal institutional process that characterized the firings across the board. In a professionally run military bureaucracy, senior leadership transitions involve planning, handoffs, briefing of successors, maintenance of institutional continuity. Effective immediately is the opposite of that. It is disruption imposed on an institution for which disruption has real operational consequences. The comprehensive accounting of the full scope of the purge documented at least 13 senior military officials removed or retired under Trump's second term, describing it as an other regime change, a phrase that is striking in its precision. Regime change is the term used for the transformation of foreign governments, for the replacement of one governing class with another. And what has happened to the senior leadership of the American military under Trump and Hegseth is by that description a kind of regime change. The people who held the top positions were removed. The basis for their removal was political alignment, rather than professional failure. The replacements are being selected for the quality of implementing the vision rather than for the quality of professional military judgment. And the cumulative effect on the institution is exactly what was documented. A massive MAGA makeover of the military's top ranks, with military sources warning that the reshuffle risked making senior promotions all about loyalty to Trump's politics rather than battlefield competence. The connection to the Iran war strategic failure narrative is where this becomes most directly consequential, because the decisions that get made in a military conflict are only as good as the advice that flows into them. When the chairman of the Joint Chiefs gets fired and replaced with someone more aligned with the president's vision. When the Army chief gets removed mid-war because he would not implement the vision as demanded. When the commanding officers of key commands get removed on the same day. The people who remain, the successors who are now in those roles, have received an extremely clear signal about what professional independence costs. They have watched what happened to their predecessors. They know that honest advice that conflicts with what the president wants to hear can end your career. And that knowledge, that awareness of the price of being insufficiently aligned, changes the nature of the advice that gets offered, not necessarily through any deliberate dishonesty, but through the natural human tendency to shade judgment toward conclusions that are less likely to get you fired. That dynamic, honest military advice being replaced by advice calibrated for political safety is what makes the purge dangerous in an operational sense, not just an institutional one. The civil-military norm question is the one that goes deepest and the one that has the most lasting implications for American democracy beyond the specific context of this administration and this conflict. The norm that the military serves the Constitution rather than the person who happens to hold the presidency is foundational. It is what distinguishes a democratic military from an autocratic one. It means that when a commander-in-chief orders something illegal or unconstitutional, the officers in the chain of command have an obligation, a legal and professional obligation, to refuse. It means that the military senior leadership provides honest advice about what is achievable and what is not, even when that advice is not what the president wants to hear. And it means that promotion and assignment in the military is based on professional competence and integrity rather than on political alignment with whoever is in the White House. That norm is being systematically dismantled, not through any formal change to military law or regulations, but through the demonstrated, repeated, documented consequence of being insufficiently aligned, removal. When 13 senior officers have been pushed out, and the stated basis in multiple cases is someone who implements the vision, the norm is not just being challenged. It is being replaced with a different norm. The norm of loyalty. A military whose senior leadership is selected for loyalty to the president rather than professional competence and constitutional integrity is a different institution from the one the founders designed. It is an institution that is less likely to refuse an illegal order, less likely to provide honest advice that conflicts with presidential preference, less capable of the independent professional judgment that makes military advice valuable in the first place. Let's talk about what the military purge means and why it matters beyond the immediate personnel story. Firing 13 senior military officials, including the chairman of the Joint Chiefs, in the middle of an active war is not normal. It is not a reform, and it is not making the military stronger. Every institutional justification that the administration has offered for these removals, DEI programs, insufficient alignment, not implementing the vision, is a political justification dressed up in policy language. The actual military professionals who have watched these removals happen have not responded with relief that excess bureaucracy is being cut. They have responded with alarm. Senior military leaders were alarmed at the timing of Randy George's removal. When the people who spend their careers studying how military institutions function and what threatens their effectiveness are alarmed by what is happening to senior leadership in wartime, that is a substantive professional assessment that deserves to be taken seriously. The purge is not making the military more effective. It is making it more politically compliant. And those are very different things with very different consequences when American service members are downrange. The pattern of removal reveals the real selection criterion for military leadership in Trump's Pentagon. And it is not battlefield competence. It is political alignment. The officials being removed are not being removed for professional failures. There are no documented instances of the purge generals performing poorly in their actual military duties, losing battles, mismanaging commands, or violating military law. They are being removed for insufficient alignment with the vision, for being too cautious, for not being on board. The officials being installed in their place are being selected, according to the reporting, for their willingness to implement what Hegseth and Trump want. That selection criterion, loyalty to the political vision over professional judgment, is the same criterion being applied across every other institution the administration has restructured. The Justice Department gets loyalists. The civil service gets loyalists in place of career professionals. The military gets commanders chosen for alignment over competence. And the cumulative effect of applying that criterion across every major institution of the federal government is a government that is very good at implementing what the president wants and very poor at telling the president when what he wants is wrong, illegal, or dangerous. That is not a stronger government. That is a more obedient one. And obedient governments make the worst decisions in the worst moments because nobody in the room is willing to say stop. The civil-military norm being dismantled here is one of the most important safeguards of democratic governance, and its erosion has implications that extend far beyond the Trump presidency. The principle that the military serves the Constitution, not the person, exists because history is full of examples of what happens when it breaks down. Militaries that become tools of personal political loyalty rather than constitutional governance have been used to suppress political opposition, to intimidate civilian populations, to maintain leaders in power past the point when democratic processes would have removed them. The American military has never been that institution, not because the temptation to make it that has not existed. It has under multiple presidents from multiple parties. But because the norms of professional civil-military relations were strong enough to resist the pressure. What 13 removals in one term signals is that those norms are under the most sustained and deliberate pressure they have faced in the modern era. The norm does not break in a single moment. It erodes, removal by removal, until the officers who remain have internalized a lesson that professional independence is career-ending and political alignment is career-protecting. And once that lesson is fully internalized across the senior leadership of the military, once the people at the top are there because they will implement the vision, the safeguard that the norm was supposed to provide is gone. Not formally, not by any statute or regulation, but functionally, in practice, in the way that actually matters when the constitutional moment comes, and someone has to decide whether to follow the order or follow the law. There are two more threads that deepen the analysis of what the purge means in practice for the people most directly affected by it. The morale and retention dimension is the one that gets almost no coverage, but is arguably the most significant long-term consequence of what is happening. The United States military is a volunteer force. People choose to serve. They choose to stay and build careers in it. And the decisions they make about whether to stay, whether to invest another 4 years, another decade, another 20 years in a military career, are shaped by their assessment of whether the institution rewards the things they value: professional competence, integrity, honest advice, the kind of leadership that gets you promoted because you are good at the actual job, not because you are aligned with the politics of whoever is currently in charge. The military purge is driving away the most talented, independently minded officers, those who valued competence and honest advice. When loyalty becomes the advancement criterion, the best quietly leave, and the institution's quality erodes over time as those who stay are not always the best, just the most compliant. The allies and adversaries dimension is the one that operates at the strategic level, and it is the one that makes the purge consequential for America's position in the world, not just for the internal functioning of the Pentagon. America's military alliances, NATO, the Pacific Partnerships, the bilateral security arrangements that underpin American strategic influence globally, are built on a foundation of trust that includes confidence in the professional competence and stability of American military leadership. The purge of senior U.S. military officials mid-conflict has eroded Allied trust in America's reliability as a partner. Allies are now questioning whether future commitments will be led by competent professionals or politically selected loyalists, damaging intelligence sharing, coordination, and the credibility of American security guarantees for years to come.